talking to Russell Debney from Bridgepoint Group. Russell, one of the questions we're being asked around the COVID-19 is, what am I going to do with my workforce? Could you please give us some indications from your point of view?
Yes, Ian. Look, of course, it's a question that everybody is wrestling with at the moment. Anybody who is in business is looking hard at their forecasts and their cash flow and trying to come up with some way through this crisis. And usually in the case of most businesses, of course, salary and wages is often the major component. It's one of those areas, obviously, particularly when business starts to turn down, that people have to look to see whether or not there's reductions that can or perhaps should be made in order to keep the business afloat. So you're right, it is a hot topic at the moment, and it's also a fairly confusing area, particularly for stable businesses that haven't had to address this in the past. So what can you do? Well, I think the first thing that I would want to make very clear to all employers is that the Fair Work Act and the National Employment Standards haven't gone away. They're still there, and to the extent that they apply, they still need to be observed. And the same thing is also true, of course, in the case of industrial awards. So to the extent that any business is a business bound by the Fair Work Act, and that includes virtually every business, or alternatively bound by awards, and that also includes a lot of businesses, you need to make sure that you're very familiar with the terms of employment and the requirements of both the Fair Work Act and the relevant industrial award. There's no doubt, of course, that a lot of businesses are moving quickly, some no doubt on advice and many without advice. And clearly in these stressful times, there might be some leniency, but at the same time, no small business wants to expose itself to liabilities down the track when all of this is over. And with the benefit of hindsight, lawyers and others start advising employees as to whether or not the employer has acted properly and for that matter, lawfully. So, generally speaking, we're talking here about the simple task of reducing salaries and wages. And I guess the first thing I would say is that in the case of most employment arrangements, and this may or may not be varied by any employment contract that exists, it's quite possible for the employer and the employee to sit down together to fully discuss the current position, the position of the business, what's going on out there in the community, which of course is changing hour by hour, but nevertheless, sharing information as much as they possibly can and coming up with some arrangement that works for both of them. That arrangement can be very easily documented and agreed, and it can be agreed for a short period or a longer period, depending upon what the parties agree. And in most cases, that's probably the best thing that employers and employees can do. Where that's not possible, and that might be for a range of reasons, the question arises, well, can I just lay my people off? I've seen in the news that Qantas has done that, and every day I'm reading about businesses that are laying off employees. Generally speaking, without pay, what does that mean, and can I do that? Well, the answer is that you might be able to, and you might not. If you are a business that qualifies under Section 524 of the Fair Work Act, then you can lay your staff off, and if you do that, then they are laid off without pay. Their employment entitlements might continue in terms of holiday pay and so on, but generally speaking, they are laid off without pay, but they still have their job. That is to say, as soon as the circumstances which have led to the layoff cease, then they are reinstated on their previous arrangements. That may or may not work for some businesses. What are the qualifications to be able to do that? Well, in general terms, there must be what I would call a catastrophic event, and that means that there must be some sort of a stoppage or a quick equipment breakdown that results in there being no work. And that's the reason why Qantas succeeded, for instance. They took the view, and I think rightly on advice, that the moment that the government closed the borders and thereby meant that air traffic in and out of the country was going to be severely curtailed, that stoppage of work, and that as a result of that they were entitled to lay off their staff. And on Sunday night, of course, the Prime Minister announced the changes that we're all been wrestling with over the last 24 hours or so in relation to clubs and pubs and restaurants and so on, which of course have all been required to close. So if you're a restaurant owner or a gym owner or somebody else who's included in that list that has been announced by the government, then that is the sort of stoppage, in my opinion, which Section 524 would allow for, and as a result of that you could choose to lay off your employees, and in which case they are laid off without pay. Once again, check carefully the terms of any employment contract that exists. Check very carefully also if an award applies, because there may be some requirement for consultation and so on that you would need to follow. In the case of some businesses exercising what they see as rights under 524, they could well find themselves in some difficulty down the track. 524 is not a get out of jail card for employees. It doesn't mean that everybody can lay off. You can only do so if the provisions of the section, which are well laid out and worth having a look at, are fulfilled. If you do lay off employees improperly, then it's very likely that those employees could come back at a later stage with lawyers hounding you for all of the accrued pay and entitlements which they would have received had you not acted improperly. So if you can't lay off, what can you do? Well, the Fair Work Act is quite clear about that. If, for instance, either the employer or the employee wish to terminate the employment, then you must follow the steps that are open to you under the Act. That generally means, again, having full regard to the employment contract if one exists, to the award if one applies, and also to the terms of the Act insofar as any payments on termination are needed to be complied with. Or, for that matter, if redundancy applies in the case of where redundancy payments are payable as well. And so, in the case of the average employer, it's a period of notice that needs to be given. That notice can be served out if the employer asks for that to happen, or alternatively, the employer can choose, if he wishes to do so, to pay the entitlements, and the employee in those circumstances would leave immediately. For many businesses, termination, either by the employer or by the employee, is the best option. And I say by either because in the case of some employees, if they do terminate, they take their termination pay and possibly redundancy pay, and then they may well be entitled under the extended payments that are due under the new arrangements that have been issued and that are changing again daily for people whose jobs have been terminated. And that's something definitely to look at. But so far as employers are concerned, they may also decide, well, termination is something that I don't particularly want to do, but I'd like to take advantage of the up to $100,000 that's available to me over the next 2 quarters from the government by way of a rebate of my PAYG payments, and I'd like to apply that to keep some of my key employees in place. So the message is, I think, in summary, that if you do fall into the category of businesses that are required to close or that simply cannot operate, and make sure that that's a clear black and white decision and not a hazy one, then you can lay off if you choose to do so. But for many businesses, the best option is likely to be a termination arrangement, or alternatively an arrangement that's reached with the employee that works for both parties. So, look, it's a very complex situation that we're in at the moment. None of this is easy, of course. And to be honest with you, it may well all change again tomorrow. And if it does, then there might be new guidelines that will come out and that we'll need to observe. But I think the important thing for employees and employers to remember is that the rules haven't gone away. They might change in terms of the way in which they're currently operating, but there are things that can be done, and providing things are done properly, you'll be fine. Ian, that's the story for today.
Thanks very much, Russell.